So guys, I just saw Ghostbusters Afterlife and I want to give you a spoiler-free review. Thank you to Sam Adams for inadvertently sponsoring this review video. Well, Ghostbusters Afterlife. Whoo! It has been a long time coming. I went into this movie, my expectations were set so high, especially after what had happened in 2016 with their reboot. And I'm excited to say that this film met every one of my expectations and then exceeded them. It was beautiful. It's funny, the original Ghostbusters, the 1984 version, is one of my favourite movies, and I also think it's one of the best movies of the 20th century. And the wonderful thing about Ghostbusters Afterlife is you can tell that storytelling DNA is like built right in there. I mean, it is a story that is so character driven, and the characters in it are just, they're wonderfully authentic, which I think is one of the reasons why the original Ghostbusters succeeded and the 2016 version didn't. These characters, you've got such an eclectic cast of characters, and they are all so authentic, and you can believe who they are and you can believe their motivations, and it makes you really invested in them. And the thing about this film that I think does a better version even than the original 1984 version is it builds this mystery. And I think what's really beautiful about it, I don't think it's a spoiler to say that it starts off with a cast of characters who are unrelated to the Ghostbusters we know, and obviously you know that they're going to come into it at some point. I mean, that's why you're going to go and see the movie, but there's such a strong storyline that kicks off the movie that's kind of like outside of the core characters that we know, that really just drives it along at its incredible pace, and you get invested in new characters. It was very much the way like The Force Awakens worked so well, because they brought in new characters to the Star Wars universe and had them interact with the old ones. Ghostbusters Afterlife does that with these incredibly like smartly written characters. Like the heroine is a 12-year-old girl who, you know, is very clearly like neurodivergent, I think you would say. And yes, she's brilliant as a character. There are lots of scenes in this movie that reminded me of It, except like it had the same creepiness as It, but it wasn't like ostensibly horror. But this girl, she's smart and she's brave and she's different, but she's unashamed of her differences and she's self-aware, and it's wonderful. And then you have her brother, who is the older gangly brother, and I find it really weird because my eldest kid, he was an amalgam of the two characters, but the older brother is great because he's into this girl, and he's ashamed of the fact that his family are poor, and he loves cars, and they actually build up this love of cars as something that exists and serves the storyline, but they make it feel authentic. Like whenever you see him, he's wearing like a Chevrolet Corvette t-shirt or something like that. You have the kid's mother is, you know, a central part of the plot, and she's great because she's this sassy, nihilistic lady who's, you know, she's getting on the cusp of middle age, but she's still super hot. She actually wears this dress later on. We're like, wow, that is a very attractive lady. She's beautifully written and she's believable because she's so flawed. And I think that's another thing that was so strong about the original movie, is the characters, like Peter Venkman and stuff, weren't necessarily good characters. They weren't they were good characters. They weren't necessarily good people. I mean, there's this whole thing of why did Peter Venkman go on a date with Thorazine in his bag? So it does make you wonder, like, you know, he's not necessarily a good human being, but as a character, he's really believable and authentic, and that's what they get so right with the mum in Ghostbusters Afterlife. There's Paul Rudd's character, who's a substitute teacher, and like Paul Rudd's perfect in absolutely anything, and I think he pretty much plays Paul Rudd in this movie, but you love Paul Rudd, so he's perfect with that. The lore of Ghostbusters is like woven in there so perfectly, and again, it's what the 2016 version didn't do. It didn't show any reverence to the movie that so many people love, and this movie does. This movie is just dripping in reverence for the Ghostbusters mythos, and the way the main character Phoebe uncovers the history of the Ghostbusters is a wonderful way to introduce that to a new audience. What else can I say about it? Oh, it's a kids movie. I think that's one thing that really stood out to me, because the original Ghostbusters was like a grown-ups comedy adventure, whereas this feels more like the Goonies or something, because the main characters are so young. I mentioned It earlier, and it has that whole vibe of It. I think it's kind of like the Goonies with a bunch of kids going on an adventure, but just that sinisterness is like so beautifully portrayed, just like they did it in the original movie, and just like they failed to do in 2016. The other thing I think that works with Ghostbusters Afterlife that doesn't work with the original, with the 2016 version of Ghostbusters, is, you know, the antagonist is supernatural forces, whereas in the 2016 version the antagonist was like this neckbeard incel guy, and this would in a world in which ghosts exist, so you don't need to have a human antagonist. And that's where this movie works, because every single human character in Ghostbusters Afterlife is sympathetic and relatable. And the forces they are up against are like so evil, but again they have this backstory, this world building, which is something that the original Ghostbusters did so well. And that's mirrored so perfectly in this movie. I don't know, it blew me away. I actually had tears streaming down my cheeks when I started watching it. Before you even got to any of the emotional aspects to it, it was just because it was such a beautifully shot movie, and like the musical cues just made me well up with nostalgia. The mystery was compelling. There are action sequences that you know the kids aren't going to get killed or something like that, but yet the action sequences are genuinely exciting. You're on the edge of your seat. Oh, yeah. So the only thing I will say about it is when it's a little clumsy the way they actually introduce some of the actors of the Ghostbusters. So I'd love to know how you feel about that when you watch the movie, because I don't want to give any spoilers away. But at the same time, I feel that the expectations of this movie were set so high that you got to a certain point where there are certain things that you had to do to provide people like me with what I came to the movie to see, and yet they weren't necessarily the easiest things to flow into this richly woven tapestry of story. So I think some of those bits were clunky, and maybe it got a little cheesy and hokey at the very end, but at the same time I didn't mind, because the things that seemed like cheesy and hokey were what I had come into the movie theatre wanting to see. And I think because the movie had been so perfect up until that point, just the nuance to it, and the sort of subtle ways they managed to weave the new into the old, when those final things had to be paid off, and you know, you could accuse it of being cheesy or hokey, I didn't really mind, because I think the movie had earned the right to do that. And it was very, very emotional, and again, I had tears streaming down my cheeks. There was one scene in particular that hit me like a punch to the solar plexus, and I genuinely cried at that scene. And I also laughed so hard at so many scenes in this movie. And it's funny, because I'll credit the 2016 Ghostbusters with this. There's a scene where Chris Hemsworth draws the ghost logo, except with boobs, and I laughed so hard I nearly thought I ruptured something. And up until I saw Free Guy with Ryan Reynolds, I had not laughed that hard at any other movie in 5 years. And then for a few days, Ryan Reynolds earned that privilege, and then I saw this Ghostbusters, and there were scenes in it that I laughed so hard it hurt, and it was wonderful. And I think that's why it works. I think that's why, for me, it works. I went into the movie theatre and I got taken on an emotional journey. I got taken on a journey that made me well up with nostalgia. It made me get invested in the story of the characters and the characters' motivations and the things the characters wanted. It made me laugh out loud. It made me feel excited in the action scenes, like grip the side of your seat excited. It made me cry when you had some of the emotional scenes in it. And I felt wonderful at the end with a triumph, because obviously it's got a happily ever after. And I also felt that seeing the original Ghostbusters and the original characters come back, especially characters like Janine, that was like being reunited with old friends and old family. And that was so the roller coaster of emotions that you go on in this movie is what makes it so powerful to me. And maybe it's because I am that age. I am somebody who grew up on Ghostbusters thinking it was one of the best movies ever. It's one of the movies that made me fall in love with New York. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to come to America. It's something, the storytelling devices in Ghostbusters have coloured the way I tell stories. So it's a huge part of my upbringing and my ethos. And maybe that's why Ghostbusters Afterlife hit me quite so hard. But it's just, it could have gone wrong in so many different ways. Like in 2016, there was a definite misstep. And yet, Jason Reitman did such a perfect job at balancing every single aspect, giving us what we wanted, introducing us to things that are new, and making us feel. And I know that my eldest son really enjoyed the movie, and I think he got invested in the emotional aspects as well. My wife, she didn't quite so much, but then again, she's got a cold heart. What can I say? She's not easily moved by such things. Whereas me, yeah, I loved it. I laughed so hard, and I cried genuine tears several times through the movie, and it was a beautiful experience. And I think there was one time when I was watching it, and I just took a deep breath, and I was like, I appreciate the fact that I have lived long enough to see this movie come to me. Ghostbusters and Star Wars and things like that are very much part of me growing up, and like Star Wars was a huge part of my relationship with my brother. And one of the things that made me so sad when The Force Awakens came out was the fact that my brother would never get to see this movie. And in some ways I felt like that with Ghostbusters, but I don't think I ever had that same relationship with my brother with Ghostbusters. Ghostbusters was always something I was deeply into. But I just felt so privileged to live in an age in which somebody like Jason Reitman was given the rights to this intellectual property that his father had created, and he was given the creative freedom to take it in the direction that he wanted to, knowing what it was that people wanted, and he produced something amazing. And I was just like, 20 years ago this movie couldn't have been made. Hollywood was too cynical, but now it has come together and it's paid off, and it was a long wait, but in fact I don't think we would have appreciated this movie so long if it wasn't for the wait. I don't think we would have appreciated this movie if it wasn't for the 2016 disaster. So yeah, I felt really privileged just to be able to see this. It was like, wow, what a time to be alive. And I think during this pandemic and during all this craziness and during the weird mental stuff you go through when you're 40, it's things like this, it's things like art and movies and books and music and stuff, and they're what keep you sane, and they're what keep you alive, and they're what often can bring you joy to your life in a time when you don't have a lot of joy. So I think Ghostbusters Afterlife was really important that way, and yeah, thank you very much, Jason Reitman and everyone involved in making that movie. You did a wonderful job, and I am deeply appreciative to have been able to watch it. Anyway, that's all from me. I will do a review with spoilers as well right after I've just had a sip of beer and a quiet reflection on what an entertaining movie that was. Thanks so much for watching that video. Don't forget, I have sold nearly 67,000 copies of my novels, so if you want to find out a bit more about that, don't forget to click the subscribe button.